More bad news on the Harley Davidson front. Guys, my name is Rick and this is the HDVIBE channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about something that has created more trouble in Thailand. And if you remember, back over the summer, Harley Davidson announced that it was going to move production in 2025 of all the Rev Max motorcycles to Thailand. And I think I found the answer as to why they were going to do that, but it may have just backfired on them. And we'll get into it right after this. So that's right, guys. Harley Davidson announced in the summer of 2024 that it was moving production of the Pan America Sportster and the Nightster, anything on the Revolution Max engine platform, to full production in Thailand, and that caused ripples throughout the U.S. because we all think of Harley Davidson as an American brand, and we want our motorcycles made in America, albeit many of those parts are sourced from all around the world. Well, guys, there was a recent court decision that came down in the European Union related to tariffs and Harley Davidson motorcycles specifically that were being produced out of Thailand and shipped into the European Union. I believe the situation in the European Union is what really drove Harley Davidson to say we're going to put full production of those Rev Max motorcycles in Thailand. So let me give a little bit of background on how the Thailand plant even became to exist. So if you go back all the way to 2017 and 2018, there were an administration change in the US. There were discussions about tariffs on aluminum and steel. And there was going to be tariffs on steel and aluminum coming into the US from Europe, which obviously would impact the cost of motorcycles, automobiles, etc. Well, as a result of those potential tariffs, the European Union said, and specific to Harley Davidson, was that any of the motorcycles that are Harley Davidson produced in the US, imported into the European Union, would be tariffed at 31% versus the 6%. So obviously Harley Davidson had to do something to combat having to pay a 31% tariff on their motorcycles being sold in Europe. I've traveled all over the world as part of my real job, and I've traveled to many European Union countries, and I've visited multiple Harley Davidson dealerships in Germany, Belgium, and a few other countries that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Those Harley Davidson dealerships look just like the US, but if you look at those motorcycles, they essentially look like any of the motorcycles that you would see in the US, with a few exceptions to meet some of the international standards around lighting and some of the other things, but essentially they look just like you would get in the US. Well, if you recall, there was an announcement back in 2018 that the Kansas City production plant in Kansas City, Missouri was closing down. Shortly thereafter, there was discussions in the European Union about these tariffs going from 6% to 31%. And Harley Davidson put out an SEC document to address that because it was such a big potential impact to the motorcycle business in the European Union. And that SEC filing, which is an 8K current report, came out in June of 2018. So I'm going to pull it up here on my laptop and read it to you so you can hear some of these words that probably came back to bite Harley Davidson just a few months ago. So on June 25th, 2018, Harley Davidson put out a Form 8K, which is a current report which publicly traded companies have to put out if they have material information that needs to be shared so that their shareholders know what's going on in the company. Some of these things are so impactful that you do have to file these with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So you can find this at sec.gov and go to Harley Davidson 8K reports for June 25th, 2018. And here is their disclosure. The European Union has enacted tariffs on various U.S. manufacturing plants, including Harley Davidson motorcycles. These tariffs will become effective June 22nd, 2018. Were imposed in response to tariffs the U.S. imposed on steel and aluminum exported from the EU to the U.S. Consequently, EU tariffs on Harley-Davidson motorcycles exported from the U.S. have increased from 6% to 31%. Harley-Davidson expects these tariffs will result in an incremental cost of approximately $2,200 per average motorcycle exported from the U.S. to the EU. Harley-Davidson believes the tremendous cost increase, if passed on to the dealers and retail customers, would have an immediate and lasting detrimental impact to its business in the region, reducing customer access to Harley-Davidson products and negatively impacting the sustainability of the dealers' businesses. Therefore, Harley-Davidson will not raise its manufacturer's suggested retail price or wholesale prices to the dealers to cover the cost of the retaliatory tariffs. In the near term, the company will bear the significant impact resulting from these tariffs, and the company estimates the incremental cost for the remainder of 2018 to be approximately $30 to $45 million. On a full-year basis, the company estimates the aggregate annual impact due to the EU tariffs will be approximately $90 to $100 million. Now, this is an important part that you should pay attention to. To address the substantial cost of this tariff burden long term, Harley-Davidson will be implementing a plan to shift production of motorcycles for EU destinations from the U.S. to its international facilities to avoid the tariff burden. Harley-Davidson expects ramping up production in international plants will require incremental investment and could take at least 9 to 18 months to be fully complete. Harley-Davidson maintains a strong commitment to U.S.-based manufacturing, which is valued by riders globally. Increasing international production to alleviate the EU tariff burden is not the company's preference, but represents the only sustainable option to make its motorcycles accessible to customers in the EU and maintain a viable business in Europe. Europe is a critical market for Harley-Davidson. In 2017, nearly 40,000 riders bought new Harley-Davidson motorcycles in Europe, and the revenue generated from the EU countries is second only to the US. Harley-Davidson's purpose to fulfill dreams of personal freedom for customers who live in the European Union across the world, and the company remains fully engaged with government officials in both the US and the EU, helping to find sustainable solutions to trade issues and rescind all tariffs that restrict free and fair trade. If you read between lines in that 8K report, Harley-Davidson is going to have to move production of its European-bound motorcycles to some other place in the world that would allow them to bypass or not have to pay tariffs on those motorcycles that are going to be sold into the EU. Again, 6% versus 31%. So huge numbers that I just talked about, so huge that they had to put out an 8K. So this has been going back and forth for a number of years. But in the meantime, Harley-Davidson, as I mentioned at the onset, they shut down the Kansas City plant. They built a plant in Thailand to produce motorcycles, which is a very tax advantageous location in the world. They also have a manufacturing plant in Brazil to service the Latin America regions of the world. And then Thailand would be the location that would serve not only the European markets, but also the Asia markets for some of the smaller motorcycles. So that plant got up and operational, I believe, in 2021. And the genesis of that plant essentially was to say, we produce these motorcycles in Thailand, and now we are shipping them into the European Union. And so therefore, they're not US-made motorcycles. They're actually produced in Thailand, and they would only be subjected to a 6% tariff going into the EU because they're not sourced from the US. However, the plant in Thailand essentially was an assembly plant where all of these other components were still being made and coming from either the US or other suppliers from around the world. And then all of those pieces and parts would be shipped to Thailand, and they would just basically assemble the bike, and then they would ship them into certain EU countries and only have to pay the 6%. So they got that ruling from Belgium Customs to say, yes, those bikes are deemed to be manufactured in Thailand, so therefore they're not US made motorcycles by Harley Davidson. They're actually made by the Thailand legal entity for Harley Davidson, and then they are in Thailand and shipped into these other markets. So Harley Davidson, getting that customs ruling, went on selling these motorcycles that were produced in Thailand into the European market. So that went on for a while, but then the European Union caught on and said, hey, we don't believe that these motorcycles really is enough substance to be called made in Thailand or made in some other foreign country other than the US. And oh, by the way, we think they should still be subjected to the 31% tariff because so much of it, essentially in layman's terms, was coming from the US and just being assembled in Thailand. So there was a case that the European Court of Justice brought forth, and Harley Davidson actually lost. And I believe that was in 2021 or 2022. But then they immediately appealed. So it gave them a stay on that 31% tariff for a number of years. Well, in November of 2024, the 21st of November, the European Justice, after Harley Davidson appealed the original case, came back and said, nope, Harley Davidson, I'm sorry, but we still deem these motorcycles built in America, even though they're assembled in Thailand. And so therefore, you will be subjected to a 31% tariff on those motorcycles. So let's go back to the Revolution Max. So before this final decision came out, this case was under appeal. My assumption is Harley Davidson stated that they want to move full production of the Rev Max bikes to Thailand because they wanted to try to show more substance in Thailand, to say that they're actually producing the engine, all the components and everything is being built there. So they didn't have to either absorb that additional 25% tariff or pass it on to the dealers, which then would have to pass it on to the customers. Now, obviously with the 6% tariff, the motorcycles are more expensive in Europe, plus obviously shipping to get them from wherever into the European Union. So the motorcycles are more expensive there. So going back to the Rev Max, I've been sitting in board of directors meetings and participating in those meetings for the better part of over 20 years now. These types of things are talked through with external advisors, tax advisors, consultants, with the board of directors. So these decisions are not made in a bubble by one or two people at the top of Harley Davidson. This type of decision would have gone all the way to the top of the board and have a lot of input. And I'm sure they felt they were on very, very solid ground. But unfortunately, the European Union has ruled against them. So what does that mean for Harley Davidson? Well, our friends in Europe, if Harley Davidson continues to sell motorcycles into that, which they probably will have to pay more. It'll be interesting to see what they do with the Rev Max motors, since they're not getting this favorable ruling anymore. Doesn't make sense to produce those over there and then ship them all the way to the US. But what does it mean in the US? Obviously, Harley Davidson could potentially be absorbing a huge cost. Does that mean in order for them to get made in Thailand or made in Brazil to be able to ship into the European Union, that they'll actually shift more of engine production and all those sort of things to those plants, thereby reducing the number of jobs and production that actually happens in the US, but still produce all of that in the US? My guess is, again, we're probably going to have some discussions between the US and many, many countries around the world. I would say Harley Davidson, for motorcycles to be sold in the US, is probably going to want to keep that production here. But for all of the other markets, they may have to produce engines and other components. May actually have to be produced, painted, and completely produced in these plants outside the US. So I don't know exactly what it all means, but Harley Davidson just got dealt a big blow. And if you heard those numbers from 2017, $100 million hit to their bottom line. My guess is they're probably going to, at least for 2025, try to absorb some of that if they get those costs hit on them on those tariffs. And who knows, what does that mean? Does that mean bikes in the US have to go up as well? We saw a $2,000+ increase on the touring bikes that we've seen so far that have hit dealerships here in early January of 2025, with the rest of them coming out. I'm sure you're gonna see more price increases. Will we see reduced production of Harley Davidsons in the US as a result of having to potentially shift some of that production if they still want to play in those markets? Or maybe Harley Davidson will just completely pull out of those markets. Again, if they do that, their production in the US will probably be reduced. They will essentially be reduced to a motorcycle company that can sell in the US, possibly up in Canada, and in Mexico, South America, and Australia. Guys, if you want to see how to shift your Harley Davidson touring motorcycle easier, go check out this video. If you want to save some money on installing yourself, go check out this playlist, and also go right up here and hit this to subscribe to the channel.